Okay, everybody, welcome. This is the Underground Safety Board's potholing workshop of August 7th, 2023. I'm going to ask for roll call on a call to order. Madam Secretary, you call roll.
Ron, we're not doing roll call because it's a meeting.
It was on item 1 at the top, roll call. Okay, no worries.
Sorry.
All right. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you all for coming today. Member Charlotte and I have worked with staff to develop some draft safety standards relating to the potholing that we're looking for your feedback on today, mostly. The draft standards were developed based on discussions at various workshops over the past several years. We've heard from you that effective, important transfer of vital to good standards. So these draft standards have been developed with the understanding that everyone needs to do their part to create a safe work site. In this workshop, we will first hear a short background on the standards from staff. Then we will invite all of you to the discussion. Today and Friday are our initial workshops for the board's draft safety standards on potholing. We're hoping to get through today's agenda in the next 2 hours, but if not, we'll push the remaining on to the Friday agenda. I'll review audience participation and public comment procedures now. Those attending via webinar who wish to provide public comment may press the raise hand button in the webinar or dial #2, ##2 to be placed in the where when staff calls your name, you may unmute yourself and provide comment. So the way this will work is we'll have an introduction to the standards. Staff will present the context for reviewing the staff standards. The chair and co-chair, Randy or I, may or may not comment on it. And if not, I'll invite the public to comment and ask the hosts if there's any comments. Okay, so let's move to the first one. Staff, would you like to take this?
Thank you, Member Bianchini. So for item 2, just an overview. Amber, go ahead and advance. So standards are required under 4216.18 that the board develop standards, and 3 overarching categories are specified that the board needs to adopt standards in. 1, evidence necessary to demonstrate compliance, both with for excavators and operators. What constitutes reasonable care in using hand tools around subsurface installations in the tolerance zone. What constitutes reasonable care in grading activities in road shoulders and dirt roads, which may include standards for potholing. There's some ellipses here, and I'll cover at least one of them further in the slide deck. Go ahead, Amber. The way that we're looking at this is that really safety emerges from everyone achieving excellence in their respective roles. And so excellence is the goal. We wanted to make standards general enough to allow excellence to be met in different industries and activities. There may be standards that are prescriptive, widely applicable, and necessary. And those might make sense for regulations. So in this kind of graphic of a table of what a standard may be, the way that we're developing standards, you might find some that are kind of prescriptive but are general, and those are best suited for regulations in this context. You can do regulations in any of these 4 quadrants, but realistically for this set of standards, the prescriptive end would make sense for regulations. Next slide. Just for the structure of the standards, we actually used CGA as a good model for what a standard should look like. The standard language comes above a discussion. if people are going to adopt this, they need to have better context than just what is written in a standard. So that's what the discussion would cover. And each standard has references to investigations, other standards, things that support the need and may offer some context for how to implement. And then lastly, related requirements. So these standards don't duplicate existing law, they don't restate existing law, but existing law is of course relevant here. And so we have a section for people to go and look at the relevant existing law. Next slide. Wanted to call out something specific here that these are standards related to potholing that have to do with excavation, with locating, with pre-excavation activities, but design and potholing end up being intertwined in a way you can't exactly separate. The board will be developing design standards. That's a different committee, the Planning and Design Committee of members Johnson. So you might find some standards here that call out design. You might have some discussion about information being transferred between the excavator and the operator. That might make more sense to be in design. So as you're thinking about this, also think about how design is integrated into to the goals of these standards. Next slide. And then a couple appendices that we're proposing. One is of subsurface indicators. So we wanted to, surface indicators end up being pretty important, both for the locator and for the excavator to confirm either the marks or the readings or maps that they have. And so we wanted to make sure that people in the field would be able to recognize surface indicators and what they may mean. So we'll probably be soliciting from operators images and descriptions of their surface indicators to include in this appendix. As you can see in the standards, it's not really built out. It's more just a model for what a standard of what this surface indicator library might be. And next slide. And then there's another appendix because photography ends up being important not just for the standard, but in general in demonstrating your compliance with the safe excavation laws. But photography isn't as simple as point and click. And so we wanted to put together some guide to help people understand not shutter speeds and aperture or any of that stuff, but how to, what pictures to take, what other context points, geographical points to include in those pictures, because we thought that would assist people in being able to better demonstrate what goes on in the field through images. Next slide. There are some things that are not included in this current draft that we would probably need to consider before a final. One is in one of those ellipses in the statute was considering additional excavation depth if the subsurface location of the subsurface installation is determined, but additional ones may exist immediately below. So this kind of gets at how would you dig and how much do you dig around a subsurface installation that you found. So that isn't covered in the standards and we'll need to at some point. Also, one thing that Carga has started to discuss, and we'll be interested to see what they come up with, is information sharing for shallow facilities. Particularly, they were thinking about micro trenching and the idea that an operator will know if they have a shallow facility because micro trenching is really new. So that's something that we're just going to wait for Carga and see what they come up with. Next slide. And so the standards outline things that are being discussed today and Friday are the chapters 3 through 5, locate and mark, pre-excavation and excavation. And then in the fall, we're hoping to get to design as well, or the winter, to start looking at that as a package. There's, of course, the unmarked lines and abandoned lines issue that will need to go into standards, but we're not making any proposals on that yet. That'll have to wait. And we have 3 committees dedicated to these lines of effort. One more slide. And so just to give you a sense of next steps, so workshops today and Friday are workshops on these standards related to potholing. Design standards, we're shooting for November, January timeframe, beginning of the new year. And then following that, we want to take a look at those missing elements, like how much you need to expose a facility once you've found it, and shallow facilities in the beginning of 2024. So that's just to give you context. As most of our processes are, this is not going to be immediate. So you don't need to worry about getting everything in right now, because there will be opportunity to discuss as we go down the line, but we're definitely looking forward to hearing from you to help get these closer to standards that the board will adopt. And I believe that's all I have.
Okay, so are we going to take, Randy, do you have any comment on any of that?
No, it looks good. I like how we're pointing out that there's other sections of design and the unmarked abandoned that we have other committees working on. It's going to be this whole package that is going to improve markings out in the field and working around these facilities to be safe.
Okay. So I will now take some public comment on what our leader just gave us there. So is there any hands raised?
At present, there are no hands raised.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I take that back. We have a hand raised from Todd Bloomstein.
Okay. Todd, free to go. There he is.
Can you guys hear and see me? Oh, there's my my picture. Okay, not sure why my camera's not working, but that's okay. Thank you all for hosting this. I've got just one kind of brief comment just to open up and state that this has been, you know, again, forgive me, I should introduce myself. Todd Bloomstein, representing the Southern California Contractors Association. SCCA is Association of Engineering Contractors, primarily out of Southern California, but they work across the state. They're really a good cross-section of contractors. They're not just utility contractors or public works contractors or street and highway contractors. They're all of the above. So it's a good cross-section of the engineering world. We were involved in the original legislation that Senator Hill worked on that talked about developing standards, and this was an important one to assess what is appropriate for potholing. And in a nutshell, SCCA's interest is simply to ask the operators, what do you want us to do when we come into contact with your infrastructure? To be clear, SCCA members aren't necessarily working for the utility companies. They might be working on a street or a highway, come into contact with infrastructure. In that sense, they're kind of a third-party contractor in that they're not working for the utility company, but they're working for another entity. So the idea for us was, well, let's ask the operators, let's find out what the state wants us to do when we come into contact with infrastructure that we technically have no connection with, right? Because there's not a contract with the owner at all. And the only connection is through the 811 system. So that's kind of, in our mind, in the most general sense, what we're looking for out of this particular standard. In other words, please tell us what to do when we come into contact with it. And then Chair or Mr. Bianchini, just to clarify, the term design standard, that's intended to fix the problem of certain engineers, architects, and designers using the 811 system to find out where underground utilities are. Is that correct? Is that what's meant by design standard?
Yes,
Okay.
that's for design, standard for designers.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I appreciate that clarification because it, not really, well, it wasn't really defined. But nonetheless, those are my initial comments. Looking forward to helping and providing any feedback and assistance that you and the board may need. Thank you both.
Sure. And just to be clear, we're not going to be really making standards that are going to tell excavators what the operators would like them to do. We're going to be trying to develop some standards that everybody, both operator and excavator, can agree on that are the best way to pothole and confirm that we have done a sufficient job in potholing, other than the avoidance of stubs that are sticking straight up, or kickouts that go around either boxes or trees that aren't marked. Those are really what the focus is going to be for the operators, and ours is going to be trying to figure out what is relevant in terms of how many locations of potholing do you need, so to speak. Okay, is there any other hands raised?
Yes, we have another hand raised from Eric Metzger.
Okay, Eric, when you're unmuted.
Thank you, Ron. I'm not quite sure how to make my comment or ask my question, so I'm just going to put it out there. 2 weeks ago, I was at PG&E's R&D strategic planning meeting, and one of the things that came, they're looking at new initiatives to see how they can improve all their processes and meet safety and sustainability requirements. But one of the things that came up in a breakout session is that they're looking to change their standard depth requirements for primary electric installation. That's fine and dandy, but I also, what it worries me about is that they're going to change a standard that has an impact across everybody. And are they communicating that? Should we maybe look at, as part of this potholing initiative, making sure that we have an anticipated awareness? And I think most of us that are in this industry understand that we can find utilities at certain depths. We know there's a strata for power, for gas, for almost everything, and we have an anticipated expectation that it's going to be within the strata. But if somebody's going to make those changes, does that need to be brought into a more comprehensive view or review at a state level? I think that was just one of the things that just kind of tweaked me when I saw that, because with micro trenching, as we all know, that's been a challenge. But then now all of a sudden, if people are looking, hey, PG&E wants to raise the depth of their primary, because you take those 6 inches off, that's a lot of money saved, which I appreciate. But at the same time, should there be a thought that they have to get that approved at a certain level, so that we see that as part of a standard process? Thank you.
I would agree with you. I don't think we're looking for generalizations as more as we are for specifics. Our company just a couple of days ago saw we had an electrical mark on the ground. We potholed it with a back truck, found the utility in their trench. Wasn't dictated to us on the top of the ground how many lines they were, so we found the one line. And as we were digging, it turned out that was their secondary line and had a temporary power in it. And the one below was the 12 kV that our guys dug into. Nobody was hurt, but if it was located properly and told us how many lines were down there, we could have avoided a potentially very serious situation. And so we're looking for a little bit more specifics on them at least staying with the current law, and then what we could do in potholing to be better at locating.
And one other comment. I do appreciate the fact that you're looking at using Common Ground Alliance's standards as a starting point and their approach. I literally just came from the summer meetings in Alabama, and that was we talked about depth standards as well. So I think this is a great approach to make it uniform, especially for excavators that are going across multiple states and areas. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you very much. That's a good one for staff to put down for us to talk about. Is there any other hands raised right now?
At present, there are no other hands raised.
Okay. Staff, would you like to move on?
Yeah, I think we're ready to hear opinions on the standards themselves.
Okay. So I don't really want to, this isn't about my opinion as much as it is all of yours. So is there any discussion on the standards themselves? 3.1, relevant information provided to the lotators. 3.3, use of surface indicators or confirmed instrument readings. 3.4, operator troubleshooting, contact available to locate. And 4.2, which Randy and I discussed quite a bit, is traffic control information for locators on tickets. In the interest of safety. Questions, what's still missing? Any other relevant standards and references? I'm looking for a show of hands. How many people are on the call?
At present, we have 7 panelists on the call and 25 attendees.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So let me see if I can spark some conversation, Ron. So locating, to me, and what I brought up, I think it all starts with once we have a defined work area, a good ticket, we need to put down accurate field markings as you know, the owners of these facilities. And the way to do that is by having accurate maps. And I've been in this business now for over 30 years. And like I've been telling everybody, there is no locator map that they hand you and say, hey, this is all built for locating. It's kind of, you just get as-built, you get some lines on a map, or some, you know, just different things, circuit maps. You get a lot of different things that they put together. And like Ron said, we got to put down what the law requires us to do. The marking that's within tolerance, we need to say, you know, if we have that information, the size and the type, so the excavator knows what they're looking for. And there is something to say about things being stacked, and we're going to get to that at depth later on. But mapping, I think, is so critical. And I'd like to hear from anybody that's a utility out there is, you know, do you believe the process you're working with is good? Do you see any improvements? Because not only is it getting the maps that is the best possible map you can get, it's also keeping them updated as new facilities are put in and things are changed out in the field, is to get those records changed as fast as possible at the mapping departments and back out to these crews that could put down accurate information out on the site to the best that we know about. And it really takes a good process. I'm working with a customer now, a big customer in the South, that has really improved that method. They have, they gave the ability to the locators to say, hey, this is not what's out there, because a lot of things kind of go out as built, and there's problems that could happen out there, and it doesn't get put in the way the map shows. And yet that's what the map, you know, says. It goes down and crosses the street, yet it went in on a diagonal. They have an ability that we can contact them within 24 hours, get those changes to them, and they've made a commitment within 48 hours to get those back on the maps. And then they have it electronically where our person is always pulling the most updated map. And I think that's how we improve markings out in the field, by having the right information on maps and have this process going back and forth of upgrades to the map to keep the map accurate as possible, and that information makes it out to the field to assist, the contractor, I mean, the excavator with, information out on the site.
I will gaslight that a little further in that what Randy says is exactly one of the problems, and the other is that in some of these utility companies, and if people that listen to this board meeting frequently will recall, there was about a year and a half ago, I brought into the board, we were searching for a high pressure main that could have taken out about 4 city blocks, and we were told that it stopped across a busy intersection, and our superintendent, got in an argument with him and said, no, those are your gas valves right there. And they kept saying, no, it's not on our maps. It's not on our maps. That's not us. It's not us. And so we did the best thing, was brought out a vac truck and exposed the 600-pound with the reducing to a 200-pound valve, and right where we had the dig. And so having the right mapping available is paramount, I agree, but also that the person that is doing the locating is a little bit better educated than the entry-level job that goes in at some of these utilities.
I think we have a couple hands first from Steve Cleaver.
Yes, we have Steve Cleaver from PG&E.
Hi, Steve, you there?
Go ahead, Steve. Steve, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. You may wish to run the audio test from Zoom to make sure that your equipment is configured correctly.
Go to another hand and come back to Steve.
Certainly. Next up, we have Eric Metzger.
Apologies, I'm not trying to consume all this time, but these are things that are near and dear to my heart as an excavator. And actually, this is a topic that we discussed long and hard last week at CJ. It's part of I'm part of a committee that are called Next Practices that is talking about mapping. And I think one of the key things is developing a standard. And this, to me, this is a challenge that would be at the state level, where when a new installation is done, as per our current 4216, I have to GIS map that. But it needs to be we should expand that to say it needs to be in the system within 48, 72 hours, some very relevant time upon, once that's been turned in or redlined and closed out, because that has been a significant issue that I've run into. And like you, Ron, getting out there and you find out that something was installed that nobody had a map on yet because it hasn't been, those records have not been updated. But the other piece of it to me is, how can we move this beyond a proprietary mapping system where each utility has their own, and we could actually move this to that next level? And maybe I'm talking too futuristic, where it's an open source availability. I know in the past there were what they called homeland security issues, but let's be relevant. Our focus and goal is the safety and welfare of every person that's out there working in the communities that we work in. So to me, that becomes more priority, and I can find out everything I need to know if I was looking to be a terrorist. So I find that as a lame excuse. So I just think those are some relevant points that need to really be pushed from a state level to standardize on that. And once again, I think that's something that we're looking at doing at Next Practices that could be a jumping point for the state to take advantage of. Thank you.
No, I like your point. I mean, even if it was a homeland security issue, it's something that each company could have I'm just going to use the term competent person, we could, call it something else, that signs and agrees not to share the information other than within his company to make sure that everything's safe when they're out there digging in the interest of safety. There's a lot of ways that that probably could be done together. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to kind of elaborate on that, portal for that defined work area, and it's only open for, you know, a limited amount of time. But yeah, it's something to put on paper to discuss, because the more information people have, the better everybody's off. The better everybody is.
True. Okay. Eric, your hand's still up if you want to click that off, unless you want to. Okay. Do we have Steve again now?
Yes, we'll go to Steve Cleaver.
All right, is it working for me this time?
We can hear you.
All right, outstanding. So I was actually going to go directly to the question that was asked. Once again, Steve Cleaver from PG&E. So what information locators need to achieve excellence in locating? I was actually thinking about equipment and if there was any sort of thoughts and minimum standards for locating equipment. I can tell you that over time, we've adopted new equipment that has technology that will make our locators safer by not having to enter traffic with settings that will allow you to locate with an offset and some other technology that would prevent entry into a street, perhaps would also support 4.2 there around traffic control. And if you don't need traffic control and you're able to locate it with an offset, being able to do that. If you do need traffic control, of course, having the understanding of what the limitations of a jurisdiction are, when it's required, what sort of a plan is required to be submitted. So from a locator's perspective, I think that information is important. But my initial thought was around locating equipment itself, having a minimum standard for what's used to locate. I know the government code specifically outlines at least a minimum use of a single frequency, but didn't know if there were any other thoughts around standards as technology develops, if there were any requirements for that.
I agree. If there were minimums, that would be great, but I'm not in favor of offsets. Most of the time, all the companies that we're involved with, anytime there's an offset, we know there's going to be a back charge to them because it's wrong, it's not there. And I don't know if guys don't know how to do the math. I don't know if they weren't accurate on their offset, but I would really say that 9 times out of 10, offsets are not accurate and they're not safe.
I can certainly appreciate your perspective on that from an employee safety perspective. When traffic is one of the most risky things that our folks deal with, and creating opportunities for folks to use tools that would prevent them from having to be exposed to those types of risks and still meet timelines.
No, I agree. Randy and I have been discussing that with the staff in maybe some other ways. In other words, they put a flag up that says, hey, I'm either going to need to work in your traffic control or you're going to need me to give me more time to do a traffic control. Safety is the most important thing there. And if we can set up our traffic control and then it can be done inside of that, because we obviously haven't started to dig or pothole yet until we do, there are some ways to work together on that to make sure that everybody's safe out there.
Yeah, and generally an offset mark is used to supplement the mark that's also been placed. It's typically not used as a replacement for, but it's used because you're going to have traffic that destroys marks, or you're placing the actual mark in dirt and trying to make something a bit more permanent in the offset as a reference point that, hey, there used to be a mark here, something you certainly need to pay attention to, or use vac equipment or some soft dig method to for your exploration of it.
Got it.
But any thoughts around minimum standards for the type of locating equipment, or maintaining, kind of keeping up with the technology that's available versus the use of something like I know you guys have probably all seen it in certain water districts, but people pulling out their welding rods or their witching sticks to attempt to locate something.
Yeah, Randy, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, not our first choice of using something like that, but I believe the minimum is a single frequency locator, and I believe it might say this, or at least it was talked about having this, having access to multiple frequency locators. And And, you know, whether we need to put in there, you know, about the new technology that's out there, but having having access to multiple frequencies, you know, is, in my opinion, a must, because not everything can be done with a single frequency. You can run into issues. You can do a lot more troubleshooting. And then on the traffic control, I think I made this point that back in, you know, 30 years ago, we got a lot of help with using traffic control by the person who calls in the ticket. They're going to be out there. They would make arrangements to have us come out there earlier. And those things have been kind of getting farther and farther away, where it's, you know, you guys need to handle it on yourself, where our company has actually had to go out and purchase, you know, aero boards on trailers and actually having trained people in Caltrans that can put a traffic control project together. And all that takes time. So it's kind of like our first option is, yes, working with the excavator. He's going to block it down anyways. How can he help the locating? Because some of it, you got to get into manholes. You got to get into things that are out there in the street. And safety is way more important now than it's ever been. That we do not want our people to get hurt, anybody to get hurt, and to get that help. But if it's not a possibility, that you get the time to do it correctly and safely, and to get these tickets marked in a timely fashion and accurately as possible.
And I just have a question for Steve. My understanding is you probably can't even buy a piece of locating equipment that's single frequency anymore. I don't know if that's true, but do you have any initial starting points, jump off points for technology you think is valuable to be in a standard for locating?
I think Member Charlene was headed down the right, and there were the dogs. I think Member Charlene was headed down the right path with access to multiple frequencies. Pipe horns are still available and can be used as a primary method, but really should be used for troubleshooting for the most part. So there are still single frequency devices that are available, but I think multiple frequency, not committing to any one particular manufacturer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Any other show of hands?
Up next, we have Eric Metzger.
When Steve came on, he prompted me to realize another piece when we're talking about standards. We have to have minimum qualifications for locators, and not to throw PG&E under the bus, but most locators don't have the ability to do a live face and open face open, so they can't connect to primary without bringing out a second resource. I know there's been a lot of discussions about changing that, but my point being is that making sure that the guy that's coming out to do the locate, the person coming out to do the locate, has the appropriate qualifications to do the full locate while his valuable time is on that particular site. And then the other piece that we haven't touched on, which to me is always the elephant in the room, is getting full participation by everybody that has utilities in the ground, whether it be a Caltrans, a sewer utility. You know, that's probably one of the biggest challenges, as we all know. Getting those locates are just as important as getting PG&Es or any phone one. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Any others?
At present, there are no other hands raised.
Okay, we want to move on to the next set. So next we'll discuss what information locators and excavators should record. And we have the 7 points here for discussion on point C. And that is standards 3.5 operators process for identifying or correcting map errors. Standard 3.6, utility operators located in mark domination. 3,
I
documentation.
think that's actually the next section.
Yeah, I moved on because you didn't have any more comment on section B.
I think we were on section A. I don't know that we got to section B.
Oh, were we? I'm sorry. So we need to go to B then. Yeah, I must have slowed down in anticipation. Okay, sorry. Next, we'll discuss what information excavators need to avoid unsafe contact with buried facilities. Standard 3.2, information sharing with excavators outside of uniform color code and marking guidelines. Standard 4.1, excavating facilities verification conducted prior to and separate from the construction for the designed project. 5.1, information kept on site. Standard 5.2, confirmation of marks using utility operators, responses, and surface indicators. What is still missing, and any other relevant standards and references are the questions. Take public comment, please.
At this time, there are no hands raised. Oh, wait, Todd Blumstein.
Thank you again. You're going a little bit fast for my consumption, just so you know, Mr. Bianchini, but regarding 5.1, information kept on site, it states that project owners ensure that excavators are provided all relevant documents in their contractor's possession. I'm just curious, what exactly does that look like? And through your experience, Mr. Bianchini, is that something that a city who's doing a repaving job is going to come and ask the excavator if they've have all the relevant documents? It just seems unusual, I would think, for a project owner to do that. So that's one question I have regarding the proposed regulation. What exactly is the project owner's role in ensuring excavators have all the relevant documentation?
Well, excavators are required. I mean, this is more of your comment section, but excavators are required to keep red lines. Nowadays, most of it's done in BIM. The BIMs are usually kept in a big room that everybody supposedly is supposed to keep their information and accuracy in. That sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, depending on the accuracy of what's got put in there. But it is a good, it's a good first step. Always, we think. I mean, we'd like to see anything and everything that we can possibly see.
Got it. And it just looks like it, from my read, it's more of the project owner regulating the contractor itself, which is why perhaps I'm misreading it, but it just seems a little odd to be doing that. And then secondly, the issue of keeping that information on site. I assume that could be, a foreman's truck, right? It doesn't. Not every job site has, a temporary office. So just want to clarify those two things. I know, forgive me, this isn't part of the questions, what's still missing and relevant standards and references, but just for my clarification.
That's it. And with respect to moving a little fast, would you prefer that I took each standard there one at a time and ask for comment, or let you guys pick between the ones that I read on just a discussion from this?
No, I think this is working. It's just it's a lot of information to go through, frankly, and trying to keep tabs. But I think you're doing just fine. I think you're doing just fine. But just to be clear, a contractor that doesn't have an office on a job site, but yet the foreman has documentation on a computer or in a file would satisfy this particular standard, correct?
Generally, it does, yes. Well,
Okay.
for the developers and contractors and cities that we work for.
Thank you.
And Todd, also, I mean, if you have any ideas on clarity, we're definitely open to hearing it.
Yeah, I'd like to look in and see, because it just seems a little odd that a project owner who is doing a repaving job would be interested in making sure the excavator has all the relevant documentation with regards to, you know, the underground information. Yeah, of course they're going to have that, but are you creating like a new responsibility for a local agency? And I don't know what the interplay currently is, which is why it's something I can look into, frankly.
And you know, this is maybe slightly beyond the standard, but something to think about. Todd, if you have any thoughts on it, is, you know, there is responsibility of a prime contractor to manage their subcontractors, right? And that's one kind of responsibility that goes up in higher levels. You know, that's a general thing. But then there's sometimes questions about what goes into a contract, what should be in a contract between a project owner and a contractor. And when we think about, you know, making sure that all the relevant documents are on site, what would be the best mechanism for doing that? You might not have an answer to that, but just something to perhaps think about.
Thanks, Mr. Marino. I'll definitely talk to some of our members to see, you know, what exactly, where there's not a permanent facility, right, where they're simply excavating a street, where that information is held, because it might be on a laptop of a foreman for the job, which may not be accessible to all workers, even though it should be. So it just a minor point that I'll ask around and get some feedback on.
Okay, any more hands raised?
Yes, we have our hand raised from Eric Metzger.
Told you I was going to be a pain. Just a comment that I thought about while we're sitting there. What's missing? Something that we started doing is we're really documenting crossings. So when we're crossing a utility, we're making a big point of capturing that data as closely as possible. I think it's something that we should maybe look at, increasing our capability of the detail around it, so that I know that I've got X number of inches of separation between a particular utility and another one. So that was just a thought I wanted to throw out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And don't worry about this being the Eric and Stephen Todd show. That's okay. We're not getting too many other comments, but you're right. The only discussion we have on that sometimes is the smaller, our company tries to GPS everything, and we're willing to give it to the utility or not, whatever, whether they prefer, we offer it and stuff. But for the exact location and crossings and stuff like that, it is handy, but it's also time consuming for them too. But
it will be, and you know, it's potentially relevant. And I think with everything going electronic and as tools improve, and once again, I'm looking at this from a future perspective. I think that should be less of an issue. And just like the case you were just speaking about, where you keep records, yes, they could be on a electronic means of some when you're out in the field, but at some point there should be a standard says that those uploads should be done in a timely fashion. I have no idea, but we try to do that nightly or every couple of days, depending on where we're working, if we have access to internet. So just thought.
I agree. I'm just getting just for food for thought for staff and all of us is, yeah, I'm more speaking of the contractor that Todd referred to, and it's the guy that's working out of the pickup most of the time. How often does he get a chance to do his red lines, what we used to call it, or download the data that he took from doing some shots and so forth. So yeah, mindful of it though, I agree. Any other questions?
Yes, we have James Wingate.
Okay. Hey, James.
Hello. This is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, as you know, since I'm not in the field. So I've, sorry to interrupt the Steve, Todd, Eric, Ron, Randy show, but a couple things that I really like are this concept of mapping utilities. And I know many of you have heard me say this before, but since we have 25 people on the call, that means not everyone has. But, I really think the future is, as ticket volume goes up and as all this money trickles down from the federal projects and broadband for all Americans and just aging infrastructure in general, there's going to be more and more tickets and projects. And so how are we going to keep up with this? And we're having all these problems with labor. Every both excavators and utilities and contract locators are all having trouble getting staff. So how are we going to solve this when there's more work coming down? And I think the answer is through maps and sharing good maps, but that means you got to create the good maps first. And so I like hearing Eric saying that they're capturing things that they pothole, and I believe your company does that too, Ron. And I know like West Valley Construction does it and several other large excavators. And but I also hear that sometimes when they try to give that data back to a utility to say, hey, I crossed your facility today, here's where we captured it, they're saying, no, we're not taking that because we don't know that your guy was trained properly, that your instrument was calibrated correctly, et cetera. And so I really think that part of this standard, as you're talking about, could be developing how the GPS part is captured, and then making maybe this could even be part of the regulation, but something along the lines of, a way to prove that, hey, this was captured in a good way. And maybe the surveying community gets in on this because they have a lot to say about these types of issues. And then the utility operators can trust that that data was good. And then they can accept it to help update their maps faster. And that'll help this process go quicker of getting everything mapped, and maybe even get to the point where you say utility operator has to accept that type of data if it was captured according to the standard. Something like that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And thanks for the comment. And I'm just wondering if you're on a conference call with Unfurl right there. But we have the same similar problems with some utilities that say they don't want to do that and they don't understand the land survey license laws that we're all regulated too. And so we tell them, well, then when we're digging, just come out there and do it yourself. And we kind of get laughed at and said, we don't have time to send people out there to, make sure that we have an accurate reading of our utility. But to that end, a standard would be a good thing. I agree with you, James. Any other comment? Did I throw some gas on that?
We have a hand raised from Ian Veneris.
Welcome, Ian.
Hello, good afternoon. Ian Veneris from PG&E. I was kind of curious what kind of distinctions, if any, we feel need to be made considering on the type and direction of excavation. I bring that up because in my experience, parallel either boring or trenching to a facility, as opposed to like a 90-degree crossing, presents kind of a much larger in scope and more lingering threat that needs more aggressive potholing to mitigate. So I'm just kind of curious, and also thinking back to the Walnut Creek incident in 2004, how that's kind of taken into account and what the feelings are there.
So I think that's also covered in, I think the parallel is covered in E. So further down in this agenda.
Sorry, I can table until then.
Well, and I will say that it's hard for companies like yours and everything else that really don't, when a lateral or something like that is terminated and it's maybe moved down for a larger one down the street or something like that, and the crews don't terminate it all the way back to the main, and that there's not a good record kept of that. And, the poor locator comes out and, does, and then he gets hit, and it's not showing on my map that way. And, it is unfortunate sometimes just in the way, and I think there should be some discussion in standards about, terminating lines and or abandoning them, and portions of it still being hot and not taken back to the main. We run into a lot of problems with paralleling that way, and you're correct, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's something staff should make note of too. That was a good comment. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Any other hands raised?
At present, there are no other hands raised.
Yeah, I'll give it a minute for Steve to get on and scold me, but if not, we'll move on. Okay. Just kidding, Steve. Next, we'll discuss what information locators and excavators should record. As I've already read this before, and I apologize. Standards 3.5 operators process for identifying and correcting mapping errors. Number 2 would be standard 3.6, utility operators locate and mark documentation. And number 4.3, documentation of delineations, which we just brought up. Number 5.2, confirmation of marks using utility operators' responses and surface indicators. And number 5.4, documenting utility operators' marks and the results of potholing. That's a good one. And what are we still missing? And any other relevant standards and references that you would like to discuss? Take some public comment on that, please.
We have Eric Metzger from Charge EPC.
Ron, one of the things that just popped in my head when I read the first bullet point is, correcting mapping errors, putting a standard around the turnaround to get those errors, those critical errors repaired right away, so that it's not left sitting for an extended period of time. So I think it just goes back to the relevance of how quickly any mapping information can be updated in the system.
Yeah, I concur. I was having the same thoughts on 5.2 and 5.4 there as well. There's a lot of times we do try to give feedback, sometimes just to the locator, but other times to the company in, where or why it was offered. Hey, there was an abandoned one there, or, sometimes it takes a long time to get whoever it is that owns that abandoned line to, say, oh, I'm sorry, that was ours.
Yeah, and I concur. You're right with the other ones. Just same point.
Yeah.
And just a question, maybe for Eric or for others on the call, on the standard 3.5 process for identifying and correcting mapping errors. Is the term mapping error, is that well defined? If somebody wanted to, as an operator, wanted to make sure that they did have a process, maybe they don't right now. Is it well understood throughout all the people involved what a mapping error is? Or is that something that could use more definition?
Tony, that is a great question, because I can tell you personally that how one operator defines a mapping error vice another one has bit us before. We've had issues with that. So I think that there would have to be a standard definition at the state level defined, so that we're all working from the same page. We ran into a similar situation where we hit an offset on a gas line that wasn't mapped, or so we were told. And we're still fighting those situations. So anything we can do to standardize the definition would be a good leap forward.
definitely concur with that. And sometimes funny for excavators to talk about that. I mean, you don't get to see their maps very often. So for us to define or help to define a mapping error, we're more reliant on some of the. I would like to hear a little bit more from some of the operators on that, just to, I'm sure they try to correct as much as they can, as much as it's brought to their attention, to management's attention.
And I think we have comments. First one with James Wingate.
I just wanted to say that I recognize that mapping is an enormous expense for utility operators. If they're not doing it already, the concept of, okay, we're going to start tracking everything and we're going to have to invest in this equipment to capture things by GPS, and then we're going to have a GIS system at the office and a technician to use it, probably multiple, and software licenses and expertise and data security for all the homeland security concerns that we talked about before. All that stuff could probably seem very daunting to a utility operator that may not be as modern in their operations as some of their other counterparts. But that being said, I also know that, and I hear this from some utility operators who will ask me not to name them, but just personnel within these companies who say, yeah, I really wish my company would invest in this, or my agency, my water district, my municipality, I wish they would do this. So I think that while I think there would actually be a lot of locators and technicians who are close to this in the field and at the first levels of management, not really high up, but who would love for the state to come in and say, you must do these things, because then it will force their management to make these investments, which will pay dividends in the long run. They're just not seeing the big picture now. But I really think that even if it's a money issue, the cost of labor to mark utilities is enormous. And so if you can offset some of that through technology, this is going to pay for itself over time, plus be better and reduce the risk of human error. So I just think it's a win all the way across the board. And even though it's a daunting upfront task if you haven't started yet.
And I think we have Jan again.
Yes, next up we have Jan Veneris.
Hello again. I believe it was asked, how we might want to define what a mapping error is, which is going to be kind of a foundational piece of determining how we respond and process them. I don't really have much to contribute at this time, but I just will say that the term mapping error is kind of a pretty big umbrella. It can encompass all kinds of things, such as a typo in an address, which is, based off of the map, very easy to identify and mitigate. Unmapped facilities is an obvious one that people point to a lot. But then, determining if an object is in the right of way or not in the right of way is something that a lot of maps will convey, which is hard to verify in the field. Additionally, it's often easy to identify when something is wrong, but to simply flag it as wrong isn't really good enough, right? We need to identify the correct information and to make the change in the mapping system. And identifying that correct information oftentimes requires excavation. It can't be determined by a locator in the field using an electromagnetic locator. So just to kind of expand on that, maybe get some more ideas for discussion about the wide scope of a mapping correction, or mapping error and the required steps in order to correct it.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the standards listed below, but particularly 5.4 documenting utility operators marks as a result of the potholing is really a good way to somewhat help in that portion of the mapping areas, letting them know, hey, you know, it wasn't in the tolerance zone, but we kept going and we found it over here. You know, and the biggest problem and misunderstanding I think a lot of people have with the standards are when it's not in tolerance zone, they don't just say, okay, we're free to dig, which some do. What you need to do is call the utility back out, try to get it marked again, and then, you know, figure out where it actually is, if it's there at all.
And just a follow-up question for Jan. When it comes to, 3.5 operator process for identifying and correcting mapping errors and defining a mapping error, how much of that do you think makes sense to define a common understanding of mapping error, statewide versus how much should be done by each individual operator? Do you have a sense of the what can be done by be done generally and what really has to be done specific to an operator?
Yeah, that's I think a really good question, because there's all kinds of things that kind of determine to what level something is mapped, and our GIS information systems they track a lot more than just location, right, or material, or the size of the conduit in terms of the things that we want to communicate to an excavator for 4216 today. So I see that varying wildly based off of the commodity. So different utilities, I'm sure, might want to establish standards that go above any kind of minimum, which, I guess isn't necessarily a bad thing, but, the concern being if we do establish a minimum, I guess making sure that it's not too onerous for different utility types. I spend all my time thinking about gas and electric, obviously, so it's kind of hard for me to be sensitive to other things like, sewer or pressurized sewer or whatever the case might be.
Thank you.
At present, there are no other hands raised.
Okay. We got a couple seconds on rolling down here. Discussion point B. Next, we'll discuss how excavators should pothole buried facilities that cross the excavation. And ask for discussion on 5.3 standard identification of potholing locations. Standard 5.6 identification and protection of sewer levels. So what is still missing, and any other relevant standards and references.
We have a hand raised from Ion Veneris.
Well, again, sorry to hog all the airtime. Yeah, I think this is where my question came up about kind of parallel boring and parallel excavation. And, I think I don't know, I'll just say it out loud. Like maybe it might be worth defining like a minimum interval for potholes, to include any other kind of features that require a shorter interval. Just kind of, that's something that, PG&E excavation standards are sensitive to. And we've found that, it's valuable in terms of, ensuring the safety of the public and the crews. So I'm just kind of curious what, feelings are with being more prescriptive in terms of establishing a frequency or locations.
one question is, do you have thoughts in particular about, and it might be good to bring in both this section D and E, because one of them has to do with crossing, the other has to do with parallel, and they tend to bring up the same discussion. So if you're looking at the agenda, you can see that. But sorry, what specific features do you think would be good consideration in determining a potholing frequency? When I say features, aspects, proximity, what do you think makes sense to determine whether something should be more or less frequent?
Yeah, I think proximity to the facility that you're paralleling obviously comes into account. You know, if you're working, you know, 2 feet and 1 inch away from a facility, that's obviously a little bit more risky than operating 4 feet away. So I think that could be a factor for consideration. And then, you know, I think depth is also one, because there's horizontal clearance and vertical clearance. So if, you know, potholing at a certain frequency, you know, establishes that the potential facility in conflict is, you know, installed 4 feet more shallow than the new facility that's being bored in, you know, that would be, I think, or could be a factor to reduce the frequency of potholing. So yeah, the main one, and then like features, you know, like tees, stubs, changes of direction, valves, you know, all kind of, you know, might require a dedicated pothole, is kind of my initial thinking.
I think the other big question we would want some feedback on is somebody that is doing grinding and repaving, and what would be their paralleling and crossing in the whole stream. What would be the criteria for them potholing?
Yeah, I think that's worthy of discussion as well, because especially if then by the nature of your grinding, you're able to ensure that you're not going below the pavement layer. You know, that obviously does, you know, a lot to mitigate risk.
All right, next we have Eric Metzger from Charge EPC.
I just wanted to touch on Ian's question, because I think that the frequency is important, especially, and I think he's referring probably more so to paralleling. And there are some standards out there, but this is one of those areas, if we were to try to define this at a in the standards at the state, this standard alone would be a mile long. And I think that this is one of those areas that we could leverage CGA. This is something that we could ask for their participation and to help us with creating a standard that makes sense, both here and quite frankly, probably around the country. I think that's one thing, you know, because like you said, there are standards on, and we have SOPs in our company as far as when we're paralleling something, the distance between the separations, and how the closer they get to Ian's point, the more we're going to prospect and make sure that utility or paralleling stays where we think it is. But that's just something I think that would be very difficult to write up in a single standard, and we could leverage it at the Common Ground Alliance level. Thank you.
Just a question on that. If you know of any standards, we'd like to see them. We've seen a fair amount of contract terms, but not much in the way of something that people are willing to show us publicly, for us to show the world publicly. So the extent to which those do exist, we'd love to see them.
And like you said, Tony, most most contractors have a standard. And it's been a while since I looked at the PG&E Green Book, but I believe there was some outline standards in there originally as far as when we're paralleling. So I could do some research on that and get that back to you as well.
Yeah.
Is there a hypothetical standard, Eric, that you're kind of thinking of, or you know, I know it's a big question, but you know, and not to divulge, you know, what your SOPs are, because every company's got different ones, but just hypothetically, trying to just gather some thoughts and some more feedback from some of the operators and everything else on the line.
Well, Ron, we've always at Charge have had the belief that you can't copyright safety procedures. They're open book. They should be shared everywhere. So I can pull that and share that with the board as well, so you can see what we have is our approach in our SOPs. And then, like I said, I'll have to go back, and it's been a while since I looked at the Green Book, but I'm pretty sure there was something there as well to talk about it.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. That'd be great. Okay, any other hands?
We do have another hand raised from Steve Cleaver.
Hey, Member Bianchini. The question earlier about considerations for frequency of potholing. I think the type of material that you expect to find is critical. Are you talking about a plastic pipe, direct burial cable, whether it's electric or some kind of fiber or phone cable? It really changes the opportunities for that facility to take a very different direction. Even within the same trench line, if it had some slack in it and it wasn't pulled taut, you could see a lot of meandering. So that type of information, I think, might impact the frequency of safe pothole frequencies. I think if you're talking about a 60-inch concrete pipe for a storm drain, significantly different, right? You know the path of travel for that is going to be relatively straight, and you might change your potholing frequencies. I also think that if there was some sort of an agreement for potholing frequencies based off of that information, I think of our company, and you have a gas line installed in the 50s that was installed with certain features at the time because that was a standard that are no longer features. If that information was conveyed to the excavator, the installation vintage or potential features that they might encounter, you might have a different type of an agreement on a potholing frequency. But if there is no agreement on that potholing frequency, and it's that information is probably less likely to be shared. So I think having some sort of discussion, pre-con discussion about the vintage of the installation or the material types, if that would drive some kind of partnership between the excavator and the operator, I think that information would be super helpful. And then as for the sorry to go back just a bit, when it comes to the transfer of information and sharing documentation, you were talking earlier. I wasn't able to join the conversation, I had to step out, but about the sharing of pothole information that you collect out in the field with the utility operator and the obligation to take that information, whether or not, I think verifying that information is true and accurate. If the utility operator is required to collect and retain that information, knowing that information is correct, having some level of confidence in that, not that somebody would intentionally provide false information, but that information, there may be a transposed number, it may have been a street that was incorrectly labeled. something like that, that having that information be true and accurate, and having somebody be accountable for the collection of that data, because the utility operator, whether it's us or anybody else, ultimately being accountable for that, the accuracy of that information for perpetuity seems a little problematic as years go on. So maybe not initially, but as years go on, and companies aren't around anymore, that piece of it, I think, would really need to be considered. So sorry for jumping back a little bit, but wanted to make sure that I addressed that quickly as well.
No, I agree, and there's relevance to that too, as well as as far as control points, what we use, and everything else on GPS, and so yeah, there have to be some fractions of the standard in there. The only other comment that I would put to Steve's comments is it wouldn't be fair to get an agreement after the fact with the utility and the excavator once a job has been did, because he would have no idea what his minimum requirement would have been for the potholes. So we at least would have to have a minimum, because potholing, any way you look at it, is expensive, and it's safer. Some companies do a lot more than others, but I think we got to start talking about the minimums, and then if there's going to be a sub portion of an agreement met, it probably should be between the utility and the owner prior to, because he's not really sure actually what's out in the street or the right of way or whatever we're talking about, and because it is older and not sure of the standards that were put in at that time, and that way it can be asked to be good on the job that way.
I totally agree. I think it's a new way of looking at things. I think that we're getting into an era of enhanced partnership that we haven't had before, but we also have some concerns about responsibility, the financial piece about that, the liability. So I think working through those challenges are going to be something that is going to be really, really important. I feel like to an extent we've been able to take care of a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and now some of the problems that we're going to be addressing are going to be significantly more complicated. I don't think they're all complicated, but I think that we have to look at it that way and think long-term that whatever solutions that we come up with, they are going to be things that we're going to have to work through, not come up with solutions over months, but come up with solutions over years, and really dedicate and manage the progress on some of these things, and really track logs on why we chose not to do something. And when I say we, it's the collective we from the damage prevention industry, but why we chose not to do something. That way, when we rehash this in years in the future, we can at least understand why that decision wasn't gone with. But I'm encouraged by having 25 folks on a workshop call, and having some of these open discussions. I would just like to see us continue to have workshops just like this and expand this group over time. Bring a friend, if you will.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd like to get some feedback on probably on this one, as well as jumping to the next one, because it's still potholing locations and so forth. But it is potholing in the design stage for whatever element that they're designing for is obviously the best path that anybody can take, because then it is accurately placed on the drawings, on crossings, on paralleling, on anything else that they're doing, including directional drilling or boring and so forth. If it's done at that design stage, our experiences have been super accurate. But,
yeah, and if you don't mind me addressing it, I think potholing during the design stage, I think, is fantastic. It creates a set of challenges on its own with that pothole data. Let's say you're doing a horizontal directional drilling. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to watch that bore head pass through. which means that the accuracy of the tracking information of your borehead and the boring equipment is that much more important, because you have potholed maybe weeks or months in advance of the project, and you can't leave a top hat out there in an opening, or you had to backfill and put some cutback or cold patch for the time being. And it doesn't allow for that smooth transfer of information, right? So it creates some new challenges and requires us to be really on top of our game when it comes to the documentation of pothole information.
Yeah, but in those particular cases, in the projects, large projects that I've been involved with, and just something for staff to consider on there, when that does happen and it's going to be crossing either on a diagonal or anything, it's a high pressure or a pressure situation, it requires an inspection window to be done before the crossing. So you've identified it, you've backfilled it, you put sand. It's really quick to go back with a back truck and put the inspection window on and around the high priority, and then we've sat there with companies time after time and watch that thing come up and then, oh no, that's not going to make it, and you have to pull back and change the directory. But to that point, I agree. There's things to add to those comments that make it safer, and it's just it requires more work, but we're all willing to do more work to safety.
Yeah, and backfilling requirements, and for traffic safety or for pedestrian safety, and making sure that you have the right level of protection for open trenches and things of that nature as the project goes on. If you're going to have trench plates out there or whatever, just making sure that all of those things, and every jurisdiction is going to be a little bit different. Every city is going to require different paving requirements if it's in franchise or rehabilitation of sidewalks. So just knowing that it would be great to have some sort of consistency across the public works industry for jobs that are potholed far enough in advance. That way you don't get penalized by the jurisdiction that you happen to be doing this in, right?
Also good for staff to have. Any other hands raised?
Yes, we have a hand raised from Tom Bloomstein.
Thanks again, Todd Bloomstein, on behalf of the Southern California Contractors Association. And I appreciate the conversation about sharing potholing information, which would be intended, as I would interpret it, to verify the exact location of where that underground infrastructure is exactly located. And that makes sense for some type of construction work if you're working for the utility or for utilities. But here's where some of the complexity comes in. We're talking about a whole variety of different types of construction. Is there an expectation that a contractor that's grinding the asphalt and who is potholing to make sure that whatever infrastructure is down there is at a right depth? Is there an expectation that that grinding contractor who's working for the city, not for a utility company, would then share that information with utility? And some of the responses I've heard from industry has been, Todd, don't make us pay extra to tell the utility companies where their infrastructure is. That's not in our business. Our business is to grind and then repave the street. So just wanted to comment there on that particular issue about sharing information and the idea of exactly locating where the utility is and then sharing it with utility companies. Thanks, Mr. Mankini.
Yeah, I agree, and that that's what we were kind of directing staff a little bit there towards. Is it's a different standard for grind and repave than it is for excavate or dig subgrade and build back up a subgrade and rock and pave. Yeah, it's going to have some subsets to it. I think staff already, Randy and I have already brought that up to them, and it's it's great that you're bringing it up in this dialogue for other people may comment on it as well, because it isn't one size fits all. I agree with you.
Thank you, Mr. Bianchini, for recognizing that. Appreciate it.
You have any other hands on discussion point B?
Yes, we have James Wingate.
Okay.
I think Steve and Todd both made excellent comments, and perhaps my suggestion came off as a little too impatient as far as wanting to get everything mapped. I get that if I'm PG&E and some contractor gives me data and I'm forced to receive it and use it forever, I see his point. And then I also see Todd's point about not every excavator is equipped to do that type of stuff, especially the grinders and pavers and people who do road work that's mostly on the surface and not doing the deep storm drain reconstruction and that type of thing. So I wasn't meaning to imply that I want to force every excavator to do that. I'm just trying to think of ways where we can get everything mapped quicker. And so I think that if there are companies who are already doing it, such as Preston and West Valley and Charge and things like that, then maybe those are the ones who share. And perhaps we let the utilities make the standard so that they know that. And it could be as strict as they want, as far as if you collect it in this manner, then we will take it. And or maybe it's something like, I don't know. I'm not trying to force anyone to do anything. I just don't want us to have a mindset of the only time a utility is going to get mapped is when the owner of that utility inspects that facility themselves. Because, what if it was a plastic gas line they just put in last month? That's not going to need maintenance for decades potentially. And so other than tracer wire and exercising valves and things like that, but there may not even be a need to uncover that from their own company. And so that'll never get in the system if we don't allow other parties who are going to be crossing it for other purposes to capture that data. So maybe we find some compromise in the middle. But I guess I don't want the utility operators to have the attitude or feel like they're being forced to accept data. I would rather persuade them to want to accept data because they see value in mapping their own system and see value in having another source provide it to them that's a lot cheaper than them going to dig it up themselves, because nobody can afford to dig up things just to map them, right? So anyway, that's just, I just didn't want to come across as trying to force excavators or utility operators down that path, just looking for ways to collaborate and help the system improve more quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wingate. I agree. Any other hands on this discussion point B?
There are no raised hands at present.
Okay, let's move to discussion point E, and it's obviously very similar to what D was. It's just focusing strictly on the standard 5.3 identification of potholing locations. What is still missing and any other relevant standards or references that we can discuss. Open to discussion. The portion on the
We have a raised hand from Todd Bloomstein.
Either one works. Thank you. It's like
sorry about that.
No, it's okay, man. It's like going fishing when you got a fish on. Hey, we got somebody's hands up. I appreciate it. I'm the fish. I just thought just thinking in simple terms, is it worth mentioning for different locations, whether it's in a rural area or a suburban area or a tight urban area. It just seems like any type of frequency or potholing locations would be different considering where you are. Just something to think about.
Good point. Might be a hard standard, right? But, on this particular one, I think we're kind of looking for discussing how excavators should pothole buried facilities that run parallel to an excavation a little bit more specifically. I think should have probably clarified that slightly.
Thanks, Mr. Bianchini. I have a tendency to just, I'm not reading the titles, the top, I'm just reading, forgive me.
I should have started it out that way, but I agree with your point, because I mean, most of us larger excavators, have any number of crews in all of those scenarios. And there is not a one size fits all for that. I'm really agreeing with your point you brought up. It's a good point for everything we've discussed today.
And just to ask a question on that, is there anything in the population density, urban versus rural, that isn't already captured in the proximity of the excavation to the facility, or the type of facility, or the pertinence the facility might have? I'm just trying to make sure I understand what specifically might lead someone to think about potholing different, urban versus rural, that may be separate from those other things like proximity.
Well, I'll just answer from my point of view that in rural, it's a lot easier to determine where laterals are, because there's a house every half a mile, in an agricultural community or something like that. And you can drive by and see that either they have a gas meter or they don't, and you're looking at the line. It's easier to go up and say, hey, do you guys have gas, or are you on propane? Those kind of things, same with water out there. A lot of people have wells. There's less need for potholing other than what's marked out there than there is in the urban and city areas. There's a great known to it, because each house, if you're in an area that takes gas, it's got one of the larger utility companies in the state of the three, and it's going to have that. If it's rural, it's propane, it's all held within the property. So I mean, there's a lot of things that excavators have a known to, but require potholing.
And Tony, I think of proximity simply as the distance, right, from whatever facility to the excavation area. But to Mr. Bianchini's point, I think obviously you're going to have a higher density of closer utilities, but to your point, I think so. I think I don't know. Perhaps define proximity. What exactly do you mean by proximity here, Tony?
So what I've heard is proximity in terms of if we're talking about parallel, how close are you running your excavation to that existing facility, along the existing facility? So, are you 2 feet from your pothole? Are you staying 2 feet away from it? Are you staying 3 feet away from it? That kind of thing.
Typically, it's the tolerance zone.
Okay, we have Eric Metzger from Charge EPC.
Hey, Tony, I think to highlight that is, yes, we have standards to say, the closer we are to that, and the type of facility. If it's a high priority facility, it has an impact on how much we're going to pothole for that particular thing. But if I look at what the header of this particular one is there a standard or an approach I take for potholing? If I'm paralleling something and I'm potholing it just to ensure that it stays online, I'm not looking to make a 2x2 hole over that particular item. I'm just want to verify that it is staying in the anticipated route. Now, if it deviates, I will have to extend or enlarge that hole until I locate it. But I'm going to be as minimally invasive as possible while I'm running, or I'm checking my potholes as I'm paralleling something, if that makes sense.
Next, we have Dave Wright.
Yes, this isn't exactly related to parallel, but from my old operating days in petroleum pipelines and the farming community, one of our major problems was the loss of ground cover over, 3 or 4 decades of a pipeline being in there, and the farmers have farmed, and eventually the wind or the farming activity has lowered the level of the cover. And I think that's an important area that may want to be considered as far as some kind of periodic potholing in rural areas where you've got farming, just to confirm that you still have the cover that people expect that you have.
Yeah, that's been brought up in many of our board meetings over the years, because we do have the agricultural permit portion that the annual one that we brought up, and the standards for potholing and locating on that as well. It's, yeah, it is, that's a real big issue. You're right, and thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely when we're talking about parallel, that also includes going over top. But I think most of the features we've talked about so far have been not looked at the terrain itself and the land itself as a feature to consider, which may apply mostly when you're going above something more than if you're going to the side of it.
But it is a good point for staff to just in situations like that with high priorities, there should be some potholing to make sure that the depth is maintained as it is, it's found the first time.
At present, there are no other hands raised.
Okay. So we'll move on to the last thing is our discussion point F, and that is, lastly, we'll discuss the standards may be appropriate for regulations, or basically which standards would be appropriate for regulations, and we'd want a little bit of discussion on that from any of the attendees that want to toss in their 2 cents.
We have a hand raised from Todd Bloomstein.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Bianchini. Perhaps before we enter into this discussion, perhaps staff could distinguish the difference between a standard and a regulation.
Yeah, so we're thinking about standards much as like Common Ground Alliance, as the various association of civil, or American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCEs. They have certainly ones on subsurface utilities, on information sharing. So those are standards that, generally speaking, are not required by statute. When you write a standard that's not required by statute, you end up writing it different than you would a regulation. So when we're talking about the standards and the language we've used so far, we're talking about non-regulatory. So they would be voluntary. There might be some pressure to adopt standards from, a project owner or an insurance company or whatever, but that wouldn't be done by the state. A regulation, on the other hand, is a specifically enforceable act. And so why you might want a regulation instead of a standard is if you really think that excavators should be doing X and not all of them are. And it should be mandatory. On the other hand, why you might want something as voluntary is you think that it is a lot easier for somebody to figure out how to do it when they're in control of it, and they might not, as opposed to doing it because they're required. With what we've written, we think that those things that are better for regulations are more specific, widely applicable, as they would have to be, and necessary. And likely more prescriptive. Does that help?
Yeah, for me, that's spot on. Thank you, Tony, for that. Having said that and defined it, and considering the complexity of what we're talking about, potholing and the different areas of excavation, the different types of excavation, the different types of utilities, the different types of material, and how and pipes and how those facilities are buried underground. I would think we should start with just strictly standards, personally, without talking to SCCA about this. But I think you start off with standards, develop those, and then if anything rises to a higher level that should be enforceable, then consider it regulations. That would be my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Any other hands?
There are no other hands raised at this point.
Okay. We got a couple of seconds for while I am. We are about done. So first off, I'd like to thank everybody. Most of the people that are commenting, I've even met at our board meetings or on some of these others, and I really appreciate your thought. Some of the other, 15 of you or so, feel free to jump in next time we have one. It's open dialogue. That's what we're looking for. Well, thanks for attending the workshop today. If you have any further information you'd like to share, please email it to the email that just came up on your screen there. And since we finished here just before the 2 hours, I'm going to give you all Friday off. You don't have to show up to this there because we have nothing more to talk about at this point. So
we do actually have some things for Friday.
Do you want to do you want to show up again on Friday?
We have some discussions on Friday about, let's see.
Not on my.
That is interesting. Might need to update. So one of the things that we didn't talk about that we wanted to talk about was depth. There's some discussion about depth in these draft standards, and depth is one of those things that people have very strong opinions on. So that was what we thought we would do as well, but yeah, I agree. I don't see it on the agenda.
It did come up at one point. We still have, if anybody wants to talk about it. I mean, we talked about inspection windows and things like that when depths are not clearly, or it's pothole, or it's a high, high facility. But to that end, one of the thought process are, and anybody that wants to expand on it would be, is that if you have a specific dig that you have to do, what elevation do you think you should be required to go down past the level of your invert or your bottom of your trench line is required to ensure that utility, you're not going to come in contact with that utility. And knowing that the problem is, if you didn't find it to that depth, it doesn't mean it wasn't necessarily there. It could have been off to the side. It could have been, I mean, that's the challenge to it. That's kind of Tony's question there. And at what point do we stop trying to find it?
Well, and also, Ron, aren't we talking about with depth? Say you do find a facility that you cannot verify how many, the material or the number, say it's encased in some kind of slurry or concrete. Is there a depth? Because I believe there should be a depth that you go below the facility, kind of get your eyes all the way around something, because there is stacking of ducts, stacking of facilities. You know, what is reasonable, where maybe not reasonable is, you know, you're digging down 15 feet, making someone, you know, pothole down 15 feet. That doesn't sound reasonable. But what is reasonable when you're not finding it, and then also when you do find it, some type of depth below the facility.
Yeah.
And I think we have Amber's going to show the specific questions from the agenda on the screen. So C and D on the screen are what we have for Friday.
So that's just a little teaser for everybody for Friday.
So depth and then point excavations, which we haven't heard much about.
Yeah, I like to encourage everybody that's on this call to try to make it again on Friday. And like Steve Cleaver said, I want to echo, invite some other people that might be knowledgeable in these areas, or in some of the other stuff we talked about. We can always use your input, either sending it to us or coming on to the workshops.
Disregard my comment. Apparently we got to be back Friday because of Tony and rain. So to that end, yeah, these would be good discussions on Friday. We'll have some good topics. So if you have other excavators, you know, that probably want to talk about some of these, great.
I think we do have David Wright might have something, parting thought.
David, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, it took me a second to get to that. This is just a question for Tony and the staff. Have you thought about or encouraged anybody from the insurance agent or insurance industry to participate in some of this stuff? The reason I bring it up is I just had about an hour-long discussion with my State Farm agent explaining to me why they're bailing out of California on new insurance for new homeowners or listing in new insurance. And it seems to me that they may have some ideas or some thoughts or how they could reduce premiums for operators and excavators if they had certain standards that they believed were effective. So that just a general question.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think, I know we had some participation earlier from them, but I don't think we've reached out to them in a little while. So it would make sense for us to reach back out to them.
Okay, there's no other hands raised, then I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we'll start again on Friday. Friday is at 9
or 10. Anybody know?
It's 10 a.m.
10 o'clock, 10 a.m. All right.